The Moore-Irwin House is a large, multi-part mansion owned by Upper Merion Township. It sits on the north side of Trout Creek, east of Moore Road, but is most visible from 8th Avenue. And I pulled up a little Google Earth. Again, I know the visibility is not great here, but you can probably see the line across the screen. That's the Schuylkill River. We're so easy to find on the map. There's a big diagonal in the Schuylkill coming up from Philadelphia. And then there's that little dip right there. And we're right up against that little curve. So if we zoom in, you can see what a busy place this is, of course. You can see there's an entire commercial zone here with the mall at the bottom. And Moore-Irwin sits right in the middle. So if we keep going in, you'll see a little patch of trees here, and that's where Trout Creek is. And as we go in a little further, there it is. So beautifully isolated. If you've ever been there, you can't see any of that stuff. It's beautiful. Surrounded by a Class 1 arboretum, for which we have some people that are in the audience to thank. We have some people from the Shade Tree Commission here who worked very hard to get that up and running again. If we take a little personal view, it's actually best, this is Moore Road over here, but over here, this is 8th Avenue. Maybe your eye doctor's over here, Katzman Eye, if you've ever been there. But if we just sort of drop ourselves down on the road and turn around, the house is just barely visible. There it is, through the trees. So that's where it is. Actually, I don't think I can, only because you can only move as far as where Google has sent their trucks to take pictures. But here, let me see if I can get in just I think I actually lost that view, so sorry. But we can check it out afterwards. So yes, it's an amazing little oasis in the midst of all that busyness that we know as King of Prussia. Okay, we all know, probably most of us know, it's been neglected for many years. It was last owned privately in 1957. The township took possession in 1972, I believe, and since then, really not much has been done with it for upkeep. It began as a farmhouse for the Moore family, and in the 20th century it was bought by Alexander Irwin, who employed Richardson Brognard Oakey, an architect well known for his colonial revival style, to remodel and expand it. So that's, again, a recent picture with you can again see the arboretum around it, and nicely marked with a sign, the Silas T. Burgess Arboretum. Okay, I need to say some thanks before we go too much further. One person I need to thank is Beth Twiss, now Beth Houting. Her 1979 honors thesis at Penn State was a history of the house, and it has been very, very handy. When you are the first researcher, you are essentially hacking through the undergrowth with a machete, doing your best to find your way through. Later researchers can follow your path, widen it, take little side trips, and find things. And that's exactly what's happened. I also have to thank Dave Broida, it was Beth and Dave who filled out an application for Pennsylvania's Historic Resources Survey, on which it was listed. In fact, I assume still is. I don't know if that's still a thing. But yeah, it was listed there, thanks to them in 1979. And the pictures he took were very handy also in 1979. And there are many of you I know who have had some part in trying to help out the building. There's one person who usually prefers to remain anonymous, but I'm going to recognize him anyway, and that's Joe Brophy, who's sitting back there trying to remain anonymous. But he has worked tirelessly to help to make this house something more than what it has been. Okay, so really we're talking history. So what sources have we used? Whew, a lot. Okay. 2 trips to the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg and 1 trip to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia with my co-conspirator in historic research, crack genealogist right there, Marianne Furman. She took a trip separately to the Historical Society of Montgomery County. We have looked at the Pennsylvania and Upper Merion tax records for 1769, 1774, 1779, 1780, 83, and 85 to 88. Some of those gaps was because there was no tax. The 1784, there was a tax, but for some reason we can't find it. Very importantly, the federal glass tax of 1798, in which the federal government was looking for a way to tax people based on their wealth, but had no way of knowing their wealth. So instead, looked at the number of windows in their house and taxed them on that. Marianne found a 1787 indenture for the Moore family. The father had died intestate, no will, and much later they divided up everything formally. So we have that. Photos of the house inside and out, many of which you'll see. Floor plans of the house. Because it was remodeled by Richardson, Brognard, Oakey, we have some nice floor plans. And then various online sources, Library of Congress, Valley Forge Park Commission, National Park Service, and on and on. So we've looked at quite a bit of stuff. Now, you're going to want to ask questions, but I'm going to ask you to hold your questions till later because I'm not telling this story in chronological order of the house. I'm telling it in chronological order of what we knew. So what we thought we knew, then what we knew, and now what we know. So your questions might end up getting answered, so I do apologize, but there should be time, plenty of time for questions at the end. Any questions about that? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, part one. The slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. What we thought we knew about the house. So what we thought we knew, and I apologize, I know this isn't very visible, that is a map of the Revolutionary Campground produced by the Valley Forge Park Commission very early in their history. The Valley Forge became a state park in 1896, and only a tiny part of it was the state park, just the area right around where Washington's headquarters is now. And what they had done is they produced a map showing who owned the land back then and who owns it now with the idea of purchasing and expanding the park. So on this map, you could easily find, and I know it's hard to read from where you are, but that says General Muhlenberg's headquarters right there. And on most park materials, it was listed that way. In fact, just a few decades later, it showed up in a Valley Forge Park Commission report where it was said, we're probably not going to worry about purchasing it because the area around it is just not being developed, just sitting there, lots of farms. Yes, that's your cue to laugh because you know what's happened since. Of course, by the time it became more important, it had been surrounded by an office park, and the park was not interested in buying an island. They have enough trouble maintaining what they have, I think, without a disconnected thing. So we all knew in the old days that it was Muhlenberg's headquarters. This is just what we knew. Everybody knew that. That was what we knew. How do we know? Like, how did that, we all knew it, but how do we know it? So where did it come from? There were numerous secondary sources that said it. I brought one. This is one of the more famous ones. Washington's officers slept here, 1953, Edward Pinkowski. So this book has that in there. I want to read you a little bit just to give you an idea of the flavor of it, though. This is chapter 25, Muhlenberg's quarters. The Moore household was astir. John Moore, who had inherited the farmhouse from his father, scurried upstairs to clean out his bedroom. His wife Jane scoured hard in the kitchen. Down the road, a messenger came. So it's like historical fiction-ish, right? And there's a problem right away because, it depends on when you think John Moore died. We know John Moore died during the encampment. So, okay. So this is a little problematic. I mean, it's nice, but it's problematic if you really, really, really want to nail things down. But a lot of the secondary sources are like that. But there are two primary or close to primary sources that this really, we think, started with. One is the Davis map, more properly, the Davis-Armstrong-Sparks map. I found a record of its provenance in the Valley Forge Historical Research Report done for the National Park System back in May 1980. A couple of researchers tried to hammer out, because there are multiple maps, and this is one of them. So the story of this map is, probably you can read it, in 1833, Jared Sparks apparently requested John Armstrong Jr., that's the son of General Armstrong, who was at the encampment, to help him ascertain the layout of the encampment, and Armstrong responded by procuring for him a map drawn by William Davis, said to have lived in the encampment during the Army's tenure there, as attested by Mr. Wayne, the son of General Wayne. And then this is the map he produced. So the nice thing about this map is it actually has troop placements, which is handy, not all the maps did, and it has marked on it some of the headquarters, and that says Muhlenberg's quarters, and that's over here in approximately the correct position. And it's a hand-drawn map by a person who lived on a farm who was there at the time. So this map was done in living memory, and not many of the maps were done in living memory. Now there's another thing. This is not quite a secondary source, but it's a primary source, but it's a lot closer than something like Edward Pinkowski's book, and that is Woodman's History of Valley Forge. Henry Woodman's father was a soldier at Valley Forge. His mother was a teenager on the Stevens farm during the encampment. Henry grew up in Valley Forge, essentially, hearing the stories of his parents and all his relatives who were there. She was a Stevens. Some of you know the Maurice Stevens house and all that. So this book is published in 1921, but it's from letters that he wrote in 1850, a series of letters that he wrote. I forget, a magazine published them at the time, but they were collected together into a book. So we're counting all the stories. So not primary source, but probably as close as you're going to get to primary. Now, I'm sorry this is a bit long, but I do want to read this to you. The Moore property embraced in the lines of the encampment and lying in the northeastern and northern section of it in the county of Montgomery will claim our notice in this communication. The greater portion of this property at that time belonged to John and Mordecai Moore and has been noticed in some former letters. On this property, fortifications were constructed and pickets placed. At John Moore's, which was the furthest from headquarters, Muhlenberg was quartered in company with a number of inferior officers, and at the house of Mordecai Moore, the commissary general of the army was stationed, and General Morgan was occasionally quartered at that place. Mordecai Moore's house is at the core of the ranger station that you might have seen if you drive up Gulf Road, and then you're going to make the left into the park, that ranger station. The heart of that is Mordecai Moore's house. And John Moore's would presumably be Muhlenberg's quarters, the Moore-Irwin house. Important also to note that there were two forts right along the lines, a little bit closer to the lines. These are outside the lines, by the way. Closer to the lines, there was Fort Mordecai Moore and Fort John Moore, basically named after them. Continuing, the farm, or rather farms of John Moore, will now claim our attention. As noticed in a former letter, John Moore, the owner of them, at the time Muhlenberg took up his headquarters at that place, died soon after on the first day of the year 1778. So the encampment was 1777, 1778. Two of his sons, John and Richard Moore, took possession of the property. The mansion where Muhlenberg was quartered was taken by Richard Moore and was the farthest extent of the lines of the encampment in a northeastern direction and nearest to the city of Philadelphia. So essentially describing the location of the Moore-Irwin house. Okay, also, now that's one bit of the history of the house. So it's connected tenuously, but connected to the encampment. But there was another historical connection. Now, some of you may have seen this sign on Moore Road. Yes, this is the other thing that we knew was true of the house, that Washington visited it. So in 1787, during a break from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, George Washington and Gouverneur Morris, that's his name, not his title, Gouverneur, visited Jane Moore. This is John's wife, Richard's mother, near Valley Forge. We know this from George Washington's diary entries. You can't get more first person than that, more primary source than that. So July 30th to 31st, 1787. Quote, Monday, 30th, in company with Mr. Gouverneur Morris and his phaeton, I think that's how to pronounce that, with my horses. Went up to one Jane Moore's in vicinity of Valley Forge to get trout. Many of you will know that the name of that creek, Trout Creek. If you're wondering about phaeton, I pulled up a picture for you. It's one of those. Spidery looking thing with big wheels. Okay, that's July 30th. Tuesday, 31st, whilst Mr. Morris was fishing, I rid over the old cantonment of the American Army of winter 1777 and 8, visited all the works which were in ruins and the encampments in woods where the ground had not been cultivated. What follows then is a long paragraph of conversations he had with farmers about what they were growing. He was very interested in that. And then finally it ends up with, on my return to Mrs. Moore's, I found Mr. Robert Morris and his lady there. Robert Morris, not related to Gouverneur Morris, but friends. They were friends. There's a question here that I've always wondered. How did they know Jane? How did they know Jane Moore? Because Gouverneur Morris, during the encampment, he was part of the Continental Congress and actually rode out with a committee to check out. And it was actually then, I believe, that Gouverneur and George became friends. Did he stay with Jane Moore? Was she part of a prominent family that he already knew? I don't know. We'd have to do some research on that. Okay, so that's story number 2 that attaches to the house. So 1777-78, the encampment, General Muhlenberg. 1787, visit by Washington, as noted in his diary. So in 1979, Beth Twist, now Beth Houting, wrote that thing that I showed you the title page of, Wintering 1777-78, A History of Peter Muhlenberg's Headquarters, as her honors thesis at Penn State. Based on the evidence she uncovered, she wrote that John Moore's circa 1750 stone house, passed down to his son Richard, was indeed Muhlenberg's quarters. She and David Broida, many of you will know that name, he was head of Parks and Rec for many years here, used the research to send an application to get the Moore-Irwin house on PHMC, that's the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission's inventory of historic places, successfully, and it was listed. In fact, this document comes from what they had on their website. Then came the ugly fact. The house was falling apart. By 1992, Parks and Rec left the house. And by 1998, I think the township, I'm guessing, if you were there at the time, maybe you can corroborate this, was probably wondering about the state of the house. Is it worth saving? How much would it cost? Most of this report done by Westfield architects and preservation consultants was how much it cost, what was wrong to the house. But they had a preface of the history, and they uncovered something. They found that in the 1798 federal glass tax, Mordecai Moore's house is listed as a stone house. Again, that's the current ranger station. But John's sons, John and Richard, are both listed as having log dwellings. So here it is. Again, it will be very difficult to read, but we can sort of zoom in. So this is Mordecai Moore, 18-foot by 26-foot stone, 2 stories, and here's the window. 3 windows, 15 panes, 5 windows, 12 panes each. You know, the panes were very important. Also a kitchen and a milk house. But John Moore, this would be, again, Mordecai and John were brothers. John's 2 sons they split the land. So John, the older son, has a 20-foot by 24-foot log 2-story dwelling. Richard, now this is the person who will eventually, come to be the person who owns and passes down the Moore-Irwin house we know, has a 20 by 24-foot 1-story, there it is down here, 20 by 35-foot log 1-story house. So there's the ugly fact. So, what do you think? Yeah, see, and this is what Westfield architects thought too. No way. Come on. Logs? You're kidding, right? So from their report, 1998 report, by 1789, however, tax assessments for Upper Marion Township list dwellings for both John Moore and Richard Moore, sons of John and Jane. Presumably one of these dwellings was the one where Muhlenberg may have been quartered and where Washington stayed in 1787, according to his journal entry. Unfortunately, documentary evidence indicates that both dwellings were log dwellings and that therefore neither could be the core of the building today known as the Moore-Irwin house. Continuing, there is no documentary evidence to indicate that a stone dwelling existed on the Moore-Irwin property at the time of the Valley Forge encampment. Physical evidence, as revealed by preliminary investigation only, that's my emphasis I'm adding, but those are their words, as revealed by preliminary investigation only, indicates that the first section of the house was built in the late 18th or early 19th century, but nothing yet identified points to a more specific construction date. Given the documentary evidence and the lack of physical evidence to the contrary, it must be assumed that the first 2 sections of the existing Moore-Irwin house were, in fact, built by Richard Moore after 1798. So this is a floor plan that was actually done it was done by the architects, but includes later bits. So it's a bit tricky to see, but this core of the house, they dated to 1810. I'll tell you how in a moment. Added to 1820, so in 1820 it was a long rectangle, and then Alexander Irwin purchased the property in 1918 and did some renovations and additions, employing Richardson Brognard Oakey, the famous architect, to make a 1932 addition over here and a 1946 addition over here. So, why 1810? They noticed a big jump in the tax value between 1810 and 1811. So they assumed, and plus Moore Road was opened at that time, Moore Road was put through, so they figured all that kind of points to, okay, that's when it became there's a stone house there. If you're ever at it and you're wondering what part they're talking about, this is from the back of the house, the south side, looking up from the creek, it's that part right there. So over here on the right is the 1946 edition, over here is the 1932 projecting backwards toward the creek. The long rectangle would be in the front. Unfortunately, there's a lot of trees in the front and it was hard to get a good shot, but from the back it's a little easier to see. You can see that bit right there would be the 1810 portion. And sure enough, when you go into the basement there and look at the joists, what you'll find is very even vertical marks left by the sawing. That means it's machine sawed. So that could be a machine in a mill that's run by creek power, like water power. So it's not, we're not talking like 1940s. It's not an electrical machine, but it's still machine sawed because they're so even. When things are hand sawed, they're a little crooked, the lines show up. There's lots of, there's signs when it's hand. So machine sawed, again, that probably lends to that 1810 date, definitely. Also, the 1998 Westfield report noted that it must have been when the 1820 edition, and again, they noticed a jump in the tax value around 1820, that the roof was raised. The original roof would have been starting down here, but this part of the house, I guess the Moore family had more money, they built bigger, like higher ceilings, and to make the old house match, they raised the roof, and that's why you end up with these little eyebrow windows, they're called. These little half windows, or actually almost like third windows. There's 3 of them on this side and 2 on the other side. So, and if you're in the house, there's like little stairs up. Okay, so the hypothesis is slain. Or is it? Or is it? See, this is the funny thing. I mean, coming from a science background, you got your hypothesis, and then you find evidence against it, so okay, so you drop it completely. There's a middle way, and that is to modify your hypothesis, right? Maybe the truth is in the middle. This is a very Buddhist thing, by the way, if any of you are into Buddhism. There's the duality, but then there's the middle way. Why do we have to always do the yes or no? So part 2, the middle way. There were inklings that something was not right with this story. We were trying to research the history of the house, just to nail it all down, and just thinking, is there any way it could have been there, But wanting isn't evidence, right? But I had reached out to Mike Bertram, who was with the Tredyffrin Easttown Historical Society. He had done a tour of the general's quarters, and it actually shows up online. You can find this document online. It was published in the Tredyffrin Easttown Historical Quarterly. So our good friends, and I reached out to him. He was very willing to help out. I asked him about this. I was actually asking him, has it ever happened that we thought one was a headquarters of a general and it wasn't? And he said, yeah, it's happened. You do research, the house just isn't that old. So there's, it's happened before. But then he sent me a picture, because I said, well, do you have anything on Moore-Irwin, anything at all? And he sent me this picture, which I had never seen before. This is before the Oakey additions. I don't know if any of you have seen this picture before. So look closely. Here's the 1810 section. Here's the 1820 expansion. This is similar to the view I took before. So this is looking up from the creek, from the south side of the house. But wait, what is that? I know it's hard to see. Do you see something over there? What is that? That's where the 1946 addition is now. That's, we all assumed, the newest part of the house. I found another picture of it. Turned out, remember the Woodman's History? There's an even better picture. There it is. What is that? That's a 1-story, 35-ish feet wide bit. That's crazy, but there it is. There it is. So, I wonder what's underneath that 1946 edition. A crawl space and joists. Look at them. Do you see different colors? Some of the wood, see up at the top of the picture, some of the wood are different colors? Yeah, they're different. Some are machine sawed, some are not. At least, I don't think so. Some of these have hand tool marks on them. So I know, again, the view is terrible in here because it's so bright, but we chose this location because we knew we would have a lot of people. We wanted more room. But there's a notch cut out of that that looks like it's hand cut. Likewise over here. This looks like what you would have when someone is joining wood together, cutting notches so they fit. Also on this piece, do you see those round holes? We don't know for sure, but that looks a lot like the holes for dowels that you would use before nails, before iron nails. So these look old. These look really old. Of course, they're mixed. This is not proof that that addition is older, because it was often the case in the colonial era and even afterwards to reuse wood from other structures to put it under there. But still, this is interesting because this is something we didn't know. Okay, so I got to thinking, what if that's where the log dwelling was? The dimensions are about right. In fact, this picture appeared in the 1921 book, but I think it's older, because if you go back to this picture where we know the date, this came from True Different Easttown Historical Society, we know this is 1898 to 1900. Look at all the trees. See all the little trees in the front? They're not there in this picture. So maybe this is older than that. But either way, what if that's the log dwelling? Now, I was talking to, there's a preservation architect who works at Valley Forge. His name is Mike Albert, and we were just having a conversation. We had a Zoom meeting. We're talking about all this. And he said it has happened that people didn't realize that part of their house had log inside. In other words, the wall had been encased, but it was originally a log structure. Didn't know till they drilled in and hit the log. What if that's it? What if that's it? It's whitewashed over, it's covered, but maybe not. Maybe it was reconstructed. We don't know, right? But it's tantalizing, isn't it? Okay, so new hypothesis. What Westfield architects and preservation consultants thought was the original circa 1810 stone structure is actually an addition onto the older log dwelling present during the encampment. Hypothesis, right? Not proof, just the idea, right? Okay. By the way, this would fall in very nicely with another bit of history that we uncovered. A few years back, Matt Mitchell, who's a teacher at the high school, did a presentation on the Eastburn family and referenced this book and gave it to us later, which turned out to be really handy for this because it's essentially a genealogical history of the family. And guess who Richard Moore married? Abigail Eastburn. So we know exactly when he got married and all that. So the Eastburn family, this is the page in there, we know they were married in 1807. We know that first daughter was born 1809, second son born 1811. You see the need to expand a house, right? Again, not proof, but this falls in line with what we know. So, is there evidence beyond pure speculation? Yes. I believe there's 4 lines of evidence indicating that the log dwelling, the one used by General Muhlenberg and stayed in by Washington, was attached to the east side of that house at that location. First line of evidence. The dimensions of that one-story section of the house are consistent with the dimensions of the log dwelling described. So this section of the house in the picture looks about right. If you go and measure the 1946 edition right now and start your measuring tape at the end and go forward, you end up with 35 feet with a little bit of overlap with the 1810. I'll explain the overlap in a little bit. It's almost perfect. So the dimensions almost work, or pretty much work. So this plan was drawn by Richardson, Brognard, Oakey in 1932. This was the existing house. I cut off the 1932 and the 1946 is here. But that's been changed a couple times. So this is the east section of the house. Here's the 1810 section. A couple ways you could go. If the log cabin attached right at that wall, then the dimensions are pretty much perfect to be the footprint of the 1946 addition. If there was more overlap, then it would be pretty much overlap with most of this. I mean, oddly enough, that log cabin was bigger than the 1810 in terms of footprint. Of course, the 1810 has 2 stories. So this leads to a second thing that we notice. This wall is very strange. It's very strange. It's going to be hard to see up there, I apologize, but I will zoom in on it in the next picture and hopefully it'll be a little clearer. This wall we think would have been shared between the 2 houses, the log dwelling and the 1810. Look at that odd shape. Yeah, okay, it's still visible. Look at that. That's a fireplace on this side and an offset fireplace on that side. And look how thick it is. It's thicker. Even if you cut off either of these fireplaces, the total width of that wall is still thicker than any other wall in the building. Compare the fireplaces just 10 years later, supposedly, of 1820. They look very normal, right? But this wall is very weird. If that's an outer wall, that's a weird outer wall, because that's what it would have been. The 1810 building is here. That's supposed to be its outer wall. Even if you say they dug a little chunk out of it for that, it's still so thick. Why is it so thick? Why is it so thick? So it's oddly shaped and thicker than any wall in there. So that's number two. Number three, I don't know if anyone's ever noticed this before, but let me tell you, being 1810, if that's a standalone house built in 1810, that would put it squarely in what's called federal style architecture. 1780 to 1840, roughly. Quote, I'm quoting from the National Park Service. This is on their website for the Hamilton Grange Memorial Site. But this is just a bit about federal style. Quote, the design of the federal style emphasizes balance and symmetry. This may be seen in the arrangement of windows, chimneys, doors, porches, and balustrades. This is that side I had shown you before. That's the south face. What does the north face look like? Here they are side by side. Again, I know it's tricky with all the trees. See the door, and it's like 3 bays wide? Look, this side, 2 and a blank there, a blank. So not only is this asymmetrical, it doesn't even match the other side. Why? Now, I tried to do it like a little line drawing to make it abundantly clear. That's the 2 sides. And that's approximately the thickness of the fireplace wall. Why would you design a house to be so asymmetrical if you had free, you just build, against the style of the time? Again, each one of these lines of evidence is not proof, but it's building a case, I hope you see. Each one of these things builds a case. So that's odd. Odd that it doesn't match the other side, and odd that it's asymmetrical in that period. Fourth line of evidence. That's the fireplace wall as seen from the inside. That's the one side, that's the other, and these 2 openings are offset from each other a bit. This is underneath that wall. Underneath that wall in the basement of the 1810 section, there's what looks like a fireplace opening. And at the top of that opening, directly underneath those fireplaces, there's wood, which is very rough, and round. You see it? Yeah. So, what if the 1810 portion was built as an addition to a log dwelling, they overlapped at the fireplace wall, and that eventually the log dwelling may have been, or maybe there's logs in those walls, I don't know, in the 1946 edition. I don't know if they've ever been drilled into. What if? Now, it may be argued that having one wall of that dwelling isn't very significant, right? I mean, is it really the place where George Washington visited if it's just one wall is left? Is it really Muhlenberg's quarters if it's just one wall? But I would encourage you to think, what is the heart of any 18th century home? The fireplace. That's the heart of the house, right? That's the heart of the house. And where do you think that trout was cooked? Yeah. Can you picture it in your head? Fire going, and there's Jane and Richard, her son, and Gouverneur and George by the fire. It's such an image. Okay, so again, not a perfect case, but I hope you'll admit it's a pretty good case. All right, so when was this log structure built? Could it have been old enough? All these other things. Well, this is a little harder to nail down. It's a little harder to nail down. We theorize that John Moore, this would be the father of Richard, husband of Jane, who died in 1778 during the encampment, being the oldest son in his part of the family. Remember, his brother Mordecai was a younger brother. So wouldn't it make sense if John moves out first builds a log dwelling, and that's how Mordecai ends up with a stone house, even though John is older. And we think that repeated itself, because if you think about John's two sons, again, Richard stays in the family house. John got married much earlier than Richard and moved out, has a two-story log dwelling versus John's left with the one-story, probably the original, we think. So, again, it's kind of hard to figure out, but when would John have built this thing then? If he did move out of the stone dwelling, which was the family house, which is what Mordecai inherited, when was that? Well, when he got married, maybe? Unfortunately, we don't know when he married Jane, but we do know when their first child was born. We know when their first child was born. So that would be 1752. So once again, John, brother of Mordecai, John's two sons, John and Richard. Richard inherits the house. John, oldest son, born 1752. So maybe, and that left, when he moved out, left Richard and Jane in the old house. By the way, it's interesting too, and this again isn't proof, but it's a little bit of an interesting insight. When you look at the values of the house, John, by the time 1798, he had moved out and created this two-story log cabin. The one story would be the original, we think, that Richard was still in with his mother. Richard, by the way, didn't get married until he was in his 40s. So he was with his mother for a long time. And just before that 1810 edition, only 3 years before he got married in 1807. But anyway, getting back to this, the values are really interesting. So Mordecai Moore, who owns stone two-story house, a one-kitchen, probably outbuilding made of log, and a stone milk house valued at $550. John Moore, log dwelling, $150. That's a two-story log dwelling. But Richard Moore's, one story, slightly bigger footprint, but not nearly the 700 square feet versus 960 for John's, $250. To me, that makes sense if the house has had more time to accrue, niceties, appurtenances. But I don't know, I'm speculating there. But we did find, now again, Richard ending up with the house that Jane was in, which connects the house to George Washington's visit. We did find in the indenture some interesting stuff. In 1787, John and brother Richard finally got around to splitting up the land officially. 1778 was when their father died. He died without a will. Also, he died during the encampment. You can't imagine the devastation of the area because of the encampment. I mean, what are the soldiers going to do? Anything wood is going to get burned or turned into a dwelling, right? I mean, that's what soldiers do all the time. So there was a lot of devastation. So it's not a surprise that it took some years before they got around to officially doing this, till they had recovered, I suppose. So in 1787, there's the four of these, I think, between Richard and his brother John and John's wife, between Richard and the two younger children who were allowing them to take the land and split it, and Richard to John, John to Richard. But there's an interesting little passage in here, which again, I know you won't be able to see, but the dower, part of the dower payable to and to be paid to Jane Moore, the widow of the aforesaid John Moore. Richard is agreeing to pay money to Jane, an annual rent, which would make sense if he were living in her house. Again, not proof, but that kind of seems to me indicating that, yeah, he's in Jane's house. We do know in any case that he inherits the house and passes it on to his kids. So returning to the question of the age of the log structure, we can ask, when would John have left the family home? Most likely when he married, started a family. Again, we don't have those records, but we do know that the first son, John, was born in 1752. So let's say the log cabin circa 1752. Now, some of you may be thinking, would General Muhlenberg really have made a log cabin would Washington really have stayed in a log cabin? I mean, come on. Because you're probably thinking this, right? Yeah. And you've seen those, right? Now, you realize what that is, though. That's a temporary hut built by soldiers out of expediency, right? Maybe what you should be thinking about is more like this. Do you know that? That's the Exley log cabin. That's the Exley house, owned by someone in the audience right here. Wonderful little place. It's a house. It's a house. It's not a, not some ramshackle cabin. And again, I would encourage you to notice the relative values. Notice that Mordecai Moore has a 2-story stone house, a log kitchen, and a stone milk house, altogether $550. Richard's got just that 20 by 35-foot log cabin, 1-story, valued at $250. That's pretty good, don't you think? Yeah, it's not some ramshackle thing. So, to put it all together, I made a little visual chronology for you. So this would be the original log cabin. We know it had 4 windows from the glass tax. So I'm thinking a window. The doors always seem to be on the creek side early on, which makes sense. The creek was the important thing before the road even existed. So I'm thinking one window on the side and 2 windows on the other side would make sense, right? So 1752, John Moore moves out leaves his brother Mordecai in the stone house, who's younger, and builds the log dwelling. Step 2, 1810, Richard's having kids. He adds the stone expansion, which is asymmetrical and all that. Step 3, 1820, got more money, fully recovered from the hole, from the encampment and all that, and then expands the house even more and raises the roof of the 1810 part. So there it is. And this would match the house that we see in the photo that came from around the turn of the century. It's time for questions, but you are most likely going to want to veer into what can we do, right? To save yeah. So let me just first say, we have a preservation architect who is willing to tour the house and give a verbal opinion on our hypothesis. If we raise more money, we could get an official report. But we need to get permission to go in the house. We haven't even asked the supervisors yet. I was waiting till this talk. I was hoping one of them would be there. I did invite several of them. But we'll send this to them and the history and all that stuff. So don't jump on them yet. They haven't had a chance to say no. But we want to get permission to go in there with somebody who's an expert. Really, to affirm, what you would need to do is do what's called a dendrochronology study. Remember that rough wood? You take a core, you look at the tree rings, and they can match it up to trees in the area, and they can pinpoint the date, the year that tree was cut down. Like, that would clinch it. These things cost money, though. So at the end of the talk, if you would like to donate, we started a little GoFundMe. So if you would like to donate to that. I'm thinking dendrochronology is $3,000. We heard that the report from an official architect, like a president, was probably around $2,000. If they just walk through the house and say stuff, that's not going to be enough, which they could do. Mike Albert, who's at Valley Forge, as a private person, not as a Valley Forge official person, but as a private preservation architect with 25 years experience, said that he'd be willing to walk through and just look. So questions about what are we going to do, I just want to not address yet. And again, if you'd like to donate, we'll have a way to do that. Please also note that we are currently working on a plan to renovate the house using mainly grant money, along with a financially sustainable use plan to keep the house going, because we think that's what the supervisors really want to hear. They don't want to spend millions on this house and then have it fall apart again. So we need to identify grants and all that. Now, they haven't even seen this plan yet, so again, it's not time to, to poke at them yet. I'm hoping, I want to do the talk today, hopefully meeting with them soon, give them the bare outline, and hopefully they'll be receptive to the idea. They're a little gun shy. They've had other ideas presented which didn't really work out. So hopefully, and if you're interested in being involved in that effort, please let us know. Please let us know.